Serafina and the Black Cloak, Chapter 20. Serafina put on the beautiful dark maroon winter gown that Braden had given her the night before. The intricate black brocade corset felt tight around her chest and back, and she worried that when it came time to fight, it would restrict her. She twisted and turned to test her freedom of movement. The long skirt hung heavily around her legs, but even as unfamiliar as the girl's clothing felt, she couldn't help but be taken by it. It felt almost magical to be putting on a dress for the first time in her life. The material was fine and feminine and soft, like nothing she'd ever worn before. She felt like one of the girls in the books she read, like a real girl, with a real family, with brothers and sisters and a mother and father and friends. She quickly scrubbed her face, brushed her hair, and made herself as pretty as she could. It felt silly, but she needed to look the part. She tried to imagine that she was going to an extravagant dance in a ballroom crowded with glittering ladies and gentlemen and boys who would ask her to dance. But she wasn't, and she knew it. When she thought about the place she was going and the dark forces she'd meet there, it felt like she was jumping a chasm and she wasn't going to make it to the other side. She tried to block it out of her mind and just kept lacing her dress up her back with shaky fingers. But she was having a terrible go of it. Normal girls must have extremely long and bendy arms to do this every night, she thought. When she was finally done, she looked around at the workshop one last time. She couldn't tamp down the feelings that she wouldn't be coming back. She looked over to where her pa lay sleeping, and she had seen how tired and overwhelmed he was. His struggles with the dynamo and searching for her these last few days had taken a toll on him. She wanted to curl up in the crook of his arm like she used to, but she knew she couldn't. Sleep well, Pa, she thought. Finally, she gathered her courage and turned. She made her way through the basement, then climbed the stairs to the first floor. At the top, she paused. She took a deep breath and then walked down the darkened corridor of the house. She walked slowly, deliberately, not darting and hiding like she normally did, but walking down the center of the wide hallway like a proper young lady. She walked like the girls she had watched from the shadows so many times over the years. She did everything she could to take on the appearance of the helpless young daughter of one of the guests. She was no longer a predator. She was a vulnerable child. The air was very still. Moonlight shone in through the windows, falling onto the marble floor. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed off the 12 bells of midnight. The quarters of the house were mostly empty because it was so late, just a candle here and there to light the way for guests. But she sensed that there were a few people still awake. As she made a slow promenade in her long, wide dress through the broad corridors of the house, it felt deeply strange not to be hunting, not to be the eyes of the predator, but the prey that is seen. Her stomach churned, her muscles flinched and twitched, begging her to dash away. She hated walking straight, and she hated walking slow. You're a normal girl, she told herself. Just keep breathing, keep pulling air into your lungs. You're a normal girl. It took every ounce of courage she had to just keep walking a straight line in the open. She'd come up against the man in the black cloak before, but she was determined to make this time different. Tonight, she was going to fight on her own terms and in her own way with tooth and claw. She lingered near the winter garden with its high glass ceiling just outside the door into the billiard room, where she knew from what she'd learned at Mrs. Vanderbilt's gathering earlier that evening, she had the best chance of setting her trap. Suddenly the door to the billiard room opened, and Mr. Vanderbilt, Mr. Bendel, Mr. Thorne, and several other gentlemen were sitting together in the leather chairs and drinking out of odd-shaped glasses. The smell of cigar smoke wafted into the corridor. Mr. Pratt came out of the room with a large silver tray balanced on his head and hurried down the hall. Serafina stepped into his shadow behind a column to avoid being seen, and there she waited, lingering on the edge of darkness. She was a china doll. She was a wraith. In and out of the shadows, a girl in between. Finally, the fireside chat began to break up. Mr. Vanderbilt stood and said good night to each of his guests. Mr. Bendel shook everyone's hand, then retired as well, and in the end, only Mr. Thorne remained. Serafina watched him through the open door, her heart pounding slow and heavy. He sat in the candle-lit billiard room alone, sipping from his glass, smoking his cigar. Come on out, she thought. We have business to attend to. But he seemed to be enjoying a moment of personal triumph. She couldn't read his mind, but she tried to piece together what she knew about him and imagine what he was thinking at the moment. After losing his plantation in the war and falling to the depths of ruin, here he was now, finally back to his rightful place again, a distinguished gentleman of the highest order, a personal friend of one of the richest men in America. All he had to do to get here was steal the souls and talents of 100 lousy children with their small, frail bodies and their pliable spirits. But she wondered, why didn't he absorb adults as well? Were they more difficult? And now that he had achieved his position in society, why did he continue with the attacks and risk discovery? If he'd been doing this for a long time, then why the sudden greed for young souls? What was driving him to absorb a child night after night? It had to be more than just the pursuit of talents. It had to be a need greater than anything that had come before. She watched Mr. Thorne as he sat on the sofa, puffing on his cigar, sipping his cognac. There was something different about him tonight. His face looked gray. The skin under his eyes was wrinkled and flaking. His hair seemed less shiny and perfect than it did the morning in the tapestry gallery when she saw him for the first time, or when he arrived with the rescue party to take Braden back to Biltmore. Mr. Thorne set his empty glass on the end table and stood, and Serafina's muscles tensed. The time had come. Like the other gentleman, he wore a formal black jacket and tie, and she could hear the movement of his patent leather shoes on the billiard room's hardwood floor. But when she saw what he was carrying draped over his arm, her breath caught in her throat. It was the black cloak, satin and shimmering and clean. The cloak was as much in disguise as she was. To anyone else, it was but a fashionable covering. To anyone else, it might have appeared that the handsomely attired gentleman intended to take a quiet stroll on the grounds before he retired for the evening. But she knew the truth. It wasn't just a cloak. It was the black cloak, which meant he was bent on malevolent purpose. Here was her enemy. Here was the fight she'd come for, but she could feel her whole body quaking in her gown. She was scared to death. At least I'm going to die in a pretty dress, she thought. He walked out of the room and into the corridor where Serafina was hidden in the shadows. She stayed perfectly still, but then he stopped just outside the billiard room door. He could not see her, but he could sense her there. He stood just a few feet away from her. Her heartbeat pounded. She had trouble controlling her breathing. He was right in front of her. All her well-laid plans seemed foolish now. She wanted to cower, away, to flee, to slink, to hide, to scream. But she steadied herself. She forced herself quiet, and she did what, for her, was the most terrifying thing to do in the world. She stepped out into the open.